JavaScript, the execution context is where a piece of code is currently running in our file. So when you create a JavaScript file, even without writing any code in it, and you save and run it, an execution context will be created. Now, in this execution context, even without writing code, you'll have a lot of things available for you. Methods and properties built into JavaScript. And you'll also have the global this keyword. And it is that this keyword that represents the JavaScript window object in the browser, or in Node.js, it is called the global object. So the things available for us in this window is everything we use in JavaScript. Like I said, methods and properties and other stuffs. So this default execution context that we get from creating a JavaScript file is called the global execution context. Okay, so if we go ahead now and declare a variable in our global execution context, and we do something like this. Let me use let my var equals, this is in the global execution context. Global context. Now, this variable is in the global execution context. It is as outside as it can be. It is not inside the function. Okay, but what happens when we create functions? So let's go ahead and create our very first function for this tutorial. And before we do that, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. So what we want to know lies in the invocation of the function. So first, let's create our function and see what happens. Function, let's call it test. And inside the body, we are going to console.log okay, let's say inside the function. Right. So let's invoke the function and also log our variable. So we'll say test. We invoke it and log the variable. My var. So when we run it now and see, what should we see first? Let's run the code. Come here and say node. What's the name of the file? Execution context. So now when we run the code, what happens? First of all, we need to know how the execution context works before I explain what is going on here. So the execution context in JavaScript occurs in two stages, or two phases rather. So the first phase is called the creation phase, and the next phase is called the execution phase. So when we run the code, we save and run it. The first phase of the execution context has started. So what happens is the global execution context is created, which is this file and everything in it. The bytecode is generated, and along with it is the global this. Once again, the global this represents the window object in the browser. It could be Chrome or whatsoever, or the global object, the window object in the browser, or the global object in Node, like we're using to run our code right now. And this global object holds every method and property built into JavaScript. So what happens after this execution context has been created? The JavaScript compiler sees the variable my var. Okay, it sees the variable my var sitting in the global execution context. So the variable is placed in the computer memory and assigned to a value of undefined. Now remember, JavaScript is single-threaded, and that means JavaScript executes the code one line at a time. It does one thing at a time, not two, not three, one line at a time. So after setting up the variable in the computer memory and assigning it to the value of undefined, the compiler then moves to the next line, which in this case will be our line number 3. So it moves to the next line, finds the function, and also places it in the computer memory. Now in JavaScript, functions are like first-class citizens. I'm going to make a separate video where I talk about variable environments. So there I'll break down how functions are like first-class citizens in JavaScript. So the function, unlike the variable, it gets placed in the computer memory with everything inside it. Okay, unlike the variable which gets assigned to a value of undefined, functions are placed in memory in their entirety. That means everything inside it. So now, after placing both our variable in the global execution context in the computer memory and our function and everything inside it in the computer memory, after setting all this up in the creation phase, the next thing we are going to do, that JavaScript compiler is going to do, is to step into the execution phase. Now, this execution phase will start from the line 7, and it starts with the function invocation. Now, something interesting happens at this point. The invocation of a function creates a new execution context. So when we hit this function invocation, this test invocation right here, a new execution context is created, and it is placed on top of the global execution context that our code has been existing since we started. So if a function execution context is created and placed on top of the global execution context. Now, this process of placing one execution context on top of another is called the call stack, or in other words, you can also say execution stack. Okay, so when an execution context is placed on the call stack, whichever execution context is on top is the one that is currently running. And in our case right now in line 7, the execution context currently running is the execution context of this function test. So inside this function, once again, line by line, JavaScript tries to run the code. But inside this function, we have only one line of code. So what is inside? It said it should log the message inside the function. So it logs the message. After logging it, there is nothing else to do inside this function. Then JavaScript removes this execution context of the test function. JavaScript removes it, or a better word to use is to say JavaScript pops it off. The execution context of this test function is popped off the call stack. Okay, so after the function execution context has been popped off the call stack, we are now back to the global execution context. Now, the next thing to do in this global execution context is to log my var, right? So now JavaScript comes down to my var and logs it. Remember, if there is no value assigned to my var, we are simply going to get undefined. Let's try to remove the value of my var. And when we save and come down here, run the code, we get undefined, okay? Because when JavaScript assign it to this our variable to the value of undefined, and it is time for it to invoke to log our variable here, it can't find any value that we assigned to it. So what JavaScript simply did is to output the value that the JavaScript compiler gives to that variable during the creation phase of our variable. Now, if we go ahead and remove this comment and we save, now JavaScript, when it comes to executing this code, JavaScript will find a value to give to it during the execution phase of our execution context. So JavaScript assigned the value, this is in the global execution context, to the myvar. And now when we run it again, we are going to see the value we assigned to myvar. So now after line 8, we are as outside as we can be, and every piece of code in our file has been executed. There is nothing left to do. So the global execution context is also removed from the call stack, or something called is garbage collected. And that is the end of the execution of our code. So as you can see, there are two types of execution context in JavaScript. We have the global execution context where everything exists, everything we can see in our code. As a matter of fact, let me show you how it works. So let's say we comment out all this, comment this out, and we go to our index.html file and we input the execution context. And we save. Let's go to Chrome and see what happens. So I'm simply going to use live server to go online. So I want us to see exactly how it works in the browser, and that way we'll be able to. Our tools, I really use Chrome. So you see, when you type this, remember I said the global this represents the window object in the browser, and this window object holds everything available for us. So you can see you have alerts, which we normally use, and you have things like clear, all those methods available for us. You have fetch, you have find, you have get selection, get screen details, all those things available for you in the DOM. And then you have other methods and properties available for us to use in JavaScript. So if we should come back to our file and do something like this, let's remove the function and see. Let's remove the function and see the comment rather, and see what happens. So now you see inside the function, and this is in the global execution context. Now if we call this again, something is going to happen. We will find our function test available in the window object. The variable won't be available because we declared it using let, and let is block scoped. So even though we declare it in the global execution context, it is not mounted on the window object. So we are simply going to see our test function. We are not going to see the variable myvar. Okay, you can see the test function right here. Function test, name test, construction function, and all that. So as you can see, the this keyword represents everything available for us in JavaScript. And when you run your code here without anything in it, you can see when we comment out our code, we still get an output in the browser because the global execution context has everything available in JavaScript. Okay, it has everything available in JavaScript. Let me add one more function to make sure what we are doing really gets out. So let's write one more function and play with it. So we're going to say function add. So Inside our add, we are going to declare two variables. Let a equals 3. Let a equals 3. Right. And let b equals, let's say 2. Then you say console.log a plus b. So now what happens? Let's also remove this function invocation right here. And instead of invoking it outside, let's invoke it inside the body of our function add. So say test, and we invoke it. Save. Okay, let's invoke the add function too. So when we run it, we see inside the function and we see 5. So what happens when we run the code? Like I said, the execution context comes in two phases, the creation phase and the execution phase. Everything has been placed in memory. Now it's time to run it. So it hits line number 13, and we enter into the execution context of the function add. So when we enter into the execution context of the function add, remember, add gets placed on the global execution context. So entering into the body of the function add, JavaScript compiler is going to start running the code line by line. So the first line it hits is this function called test. So what happens? Once again, this is a function. Another execution context will be created. With another execution context created, these variables let a and let b will be abandoned first. Then, with this execution context created, the JavaScript compiler enters into the body of this function. And once again, line by line, it meets console.log inside the function. And that was why we got inside the function first. So even though running our function out here, we place add first, the execution context has manipulated how the output comes out in the terminal. And in fact, if we go back to the browser, we are going to get the same thing inside the function 5, and this is in the global execution context. So we console.log inside the function here, and then test, we are done with test. So JavaScript pops off the execution context of the test function. So now we are left with two execution contexts, which is the execution context of the function add and the global execution context of JavaScript. So coming out of this test execution context, the next thing we are going to do is set the variable a equals to undefined and variable b equals to undefined in the computer memory inside the execution context of add. So the third line will reach the fourth line rather inside the function add, which is where the execution is going to take place. So we say it should log the value of a plus b. So now JavaScript, when it is time to execute it, it simply takes the value of a, which is 3, and the value of b, which is 2, and we get 5. So once JavaScript is done with console.log a plus b, it comes out of the execution context of function add. So once again, we are back to the global execution context. And then we console.log my var. Now, if something happens, and let's say we remove this my var and console.log it first, you see, we are going to see the value of this variable first, because running the code line by line, when it's time to execute it, JavaScript meets this variable first before entering into the execution context of this function add. So let's run the code, and what do we get? So you see, this is in the global execution context, comes first. Now we can also manipulate it. If you come inside here and remove the function test from the first line and we place it down here, what are we going to get? So you see, from the top, now the function test has come back down. You can see from up here where we have inside the function 5, this is in the global execution context. Now we have this is in the global execution context 5 and inside the function. So where you place the code lexically matters, but I'm going to create another video where we talk about lexical environments very soon. So understanding how the execution context work is very fundamental to becoming a great JavaScript developer. And the reason is because it allows you to know what JavaScript is doing every time you run a piece of code. All right. So that's it for this video. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.